As Blair just said, what we want to look at in this seminar, although this seminar has got two parts to it, so in the first part, we'll deal with some of the practical considerations about what we're calling social and spiritual networks that engage our Canadian census metropolitan areas seriously and authentically. And then what we'll do after the break, we come back in the second part, we can engage in some conversation about some of the more practical parts of how we want to do that. What I'd like to do is start off with just a couple of preliminary reflections about what does it mean when we talk about a social and spiritual engagement with our census metropolitan areas. And then I want to frame that in terms of, we'll start with the end in view. What are we actually talking about? What's the goal? And then that'll allow us to talk a little bit about our cities. I want to surface three things that I think affect just about every one of our census metropolitan areas in Canada. Out of the Census Canada data, particularly the 2011 data, which has just come out. And then I want to get into the process, because as it says in the description, I want to use what we've been doing in many places across Canada, but I'll use my own, the Census Metropolitan Area in Montreal, as that's home, to look at some of the strengths, the weaknesses, the successes and the failures of some of these networks. We can get into in a much more down-to-earth and practical way. What is transformation all about? Okay, so that's really where we want to head in the course of this hour, and then in the follow-up session. Let me start off with three preliminary reflections. When we talk about missional theology, or a missional engagement with our communities, what are we actually talking about? Let me give you two quotes. The first quote comes from what was really the advent of, or the beginning, if you will, of missiology as kind of that practical dimension of theology that deals with mission. 1910, a German missiologist by the name of Martin Koller, and he said this: "Mission is the mother of the church, theology her daughter." Well, think about that for a minute. Mission is the mother of the church, theology her daughter. And really what Koller was getting us to think about at the beginning of the 20th century, and that's certainly more true now today than ever, is that we need to begin to think about first things first. When you think about the history of the church, it was really mission that was the mother of the church. And theological reflection came out of mission. And I want to suggest that in our Canadian census metropolitan areas today, we really need to go back to the essence of that. The second quote in this first preliminary reflection is this: "It's not that the church has a mission, but that the mission of God has a church." It's not that the church has a mission, but the mission of God has a church. And so again, in the same way, what does it mean for us in our city regions to be thinking in a fresh way about the mission of God, and therefore the ensuing tasks, strategies, initiatives of our congregations? Okay, those two quotes are my first reflection. My second reflection is this: when we think about taking the Bible seriously in mission, what are we actually talking about? And I want to suggest to you this afternoon that we want to make sure that when we're reading the Bible, and we're doing it through the lens of missional theology, that we're actually looking at how the texts themselves are contextualized. And then when those first readers were reading what the writers had written, they were reading them in their context. And that exercise forces us to be reading the texts of Scripture in light of our contexts. That will free us up to realize how contextual the Bible really is. And it allows us to see the diversity of ways in which God was revealing himself right from the beginning of Scripture itself. Because I will contend, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in doing mission in our city regions today is that we don't take the Bible seriously enough. And we read it in a very decontextual way. It's almost like Paul was writing his letters and they were like memos, to whom it may concern. But I want to contend that Paul was writing to real people in real cities that were facing real issues. And it's that contextualization that allows us to think about what that means for us today. That leads to my third reflection. And that's looking very seriously at what I will call place and space. Now, place has to do with neighborhood. It has to do with your community. Place has to deal with what's going on in your geographical area. Space has to deal with the way people think, with the way people live. So your neighborhood, your city region is going to be different from mine because place is different. But there are things going on in space, in the ideology of Canadians, what some people refer to as the social imaginary. And so, in a very real sense, as we think about our city regions, we want to be thinking about place. What does it mean to study our neighborhoods, study our cities, study our city regions, study a borough, but at the same time combine that with what's going on in the worldview, the world and life view, the social imaginary of people who live in place. So I'd like to put it this way. Place is space with historical meanings, different identities, and all sorts of different preoccupations. And what I want to do this afternoon is try to put those together. And so this authentic engagement that we want to talk about is going to want to take into consideration a missional theology, contextualization, but then putting together place and space. Now, there's some stuff that we're going to fly through pretty quick this afternoon. If any of you are interested in another resource, we've put together at Christian Direction a CD-ROM which is called The Gospel and Urbanization. This CD-ROM contains about 3,500 pages of articles, all having to do with things related to city regional ministry, urbanization, the gospel in the city, what does the Bible have to say about the city. And there's 2 or 3 articles on here that I've written that I can make available to you. Now you say, why is it a CD-ROM rather than a book? You would not want me to offer to you today a 3,500-page book. You'd look at me kind of cross-eyed, like, who is this guy? Now, there's another reason why we do it this way. This resource exists also in French, and so it's much more accessible in the Southern Hemisphere for our sisters and brothers in the Southern Hemisphere to offer a CD-ROM as opposed to a 3,500-page book. Okay, so this becomes then a wonderful mission resource because all of this and then more is also available in French. So that's why we do it. So if you want to get a copy of this at the end, this sells for $15, and a lot of the resources that I'm going to talk about are on here. All you'll need, obviously, is a CD-ROM on your computer, or you can put it on a USB stick, or you can do with it what you want. Okay. Okay. Let's go from there. Let's jump in, and based on those reflections, let's begin by talking for a few minutes about, let's begin with what's going on in our Canadian city regions. What are we learning from the census data? I want to suggest 3 things. Now, I'm going to be at a high level of abstraction here, but what we're looking at specifically is what's going on in our neighborhoods. Now, when we talk about a census metropolitan area, we're talking about those 26 cities across Canada that have a population of 125,000 or more people. There's 26 of them. They represent about 78% of Canada's population. There's no other country in the world that is as urbanized as Canada. Now, obviously, I'm making abstraction here. We're not talking about the Vatican or Monte Carlo or Singapore, city-states. But we're talking about countries. No other country in the world is as urbanized as ours. Now, that's not the image we have of ourselves. Back about 4 years ago, my wife Sandy and I, we were in London. And so we visited Canada House right at Trafalgar Square. If you go into Canada House at Trafalgar Square and you look at how Canada is presented to the United Kingdom, it is presented, you know what it's presented as, the Rocky Mountains, the Great Lakes, the Great North. The image we have of ourselves is that we are the people of open spaces. The bottom line is that looks good in photos, but that's not us. We're people of cities. Now, three things are going on in the data. The first is these major changes that are taking place in our city regions. These have to do with in-migration. This has to do with the growth of cities. This has to do with crumbling infrastructure. I'm from Montreal. I can tell you what crumbling infrastructure feels like. These massive changes that are affecting our cities. It's affecting Vancouver, for those of you that are from the census metropolitan area of Vancouver, but it's affecting places like Victoria, it's affecting places like Halifax. Here's how it's affecting it. Canadian cities are under massive economic pressure. As I like to say, Canadian cities are the poor cousins of Confederation. Case in point. In the United States, if you compare their large cities with our large cities, 28% of the revenue for American cities comes from real estate taxes. In Canada, it's 52%. If you go to my province and to my city, 78% of the revenue for the city of Montreal comes from real estate taxes. So you can see cities don't have a whole lot of room to grow. If you want to understand why Vancouver is becoming one massive condominium, the answer is right there. There's no more land to tax, so what do you tax? You tax the air. And that's how cities get their revenue. And those massive changes are affecting cities big time. Now, little sidebar here. This might affect how we as Christians read verses like Jeremiah 29 and verse 7. When Jeremiah said to the people in exile, "Seek the peace of the city where I have sent you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, because in its welfare you will find your welfare." Now, most of us, when we read that verse, we think about the peace of individuals. Perfectly legitimate way to read the text. But in my mind, not sufficient. Because if you've got crumbling infrastructure, if you've got massive in-migration, if you've got 20 and 30-story condominiums going up in your city, half of which are empty because they come just an easy way to launder money, and you're forcing the poor to spread out over the whole region, which I'm going to come to in just a minute, what does it mean to seek for the welfare of your community? Now, the second thing going on in the data is the polarized social landscape of our cities. So there's these massive changes going on in our cities, but then there's a polarized social landscape. And those have to deal primarily with pluralities and secularity. Now, here in Vancouver, you know as much about pluralism as anybody, particularly ethnic pluralism. But I will contend that it's not just about cultural pluralism, because it's also about secularity. Secularity is that process that pushes God, Jesus, the Bible, religion, church to the sidelines of life. And these polarities, this secularity, is affecting how the church lives in her neighborhood. And then that would lead then to the third thing that's become very obvious in the data. It was already showing up in 2006 and in 2001. It certainly showed up in 2011. And that's what we call the dispersion of poverty. I grew up in Toronto. I grew up in downtown Toronto as a kid. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, it was really easy to take somebody and show them the poor neighborhood of Toronto. When I moved to Montreal 35 years ago, 34 years ago, I could easily take you to Park Extension and show you the poor part of Montreal. You can't do that anymore. Because what is happening in our cities is that poverty is found everywhere. It's what we call the dispersion of poverty. On Wednesday night, I was with some friends in North Vancouver and West Vancouver because I was doing a training for their church. They took me to the poor section of West Vancouver. Somebody would have never even thought about doing that with me 10 years ago. See, that's happening not just in Vancouver, that's happening all over our Canadian cities. Now, again, sidebar. Our country always defines poverty economically. So we use the consumer price index, we use the breadbasket approach, we use something called low-income cutoffs. I always say the more definitions you give to an issue, the more complicated it gets, and so therefore we never understand it. That's happening to poverty in Canada. But I would contend that if we look at poverty in our Canadian cities through the lens of the Bible, and if we take the creation texts seriously, that we're created in the image and the likeness of God, then we have a whole new lens to think about poverty. You see, being made in the image and likeness of God, that's my identity. In the creation text, when we read about what God asks us to do as His creation, those are our mandates. Now, someone who's poor, in their identity, they say, I'm nothing. And in their mandates, they say, I have nothing to offer. The non-poor, in their identity, they say, I've made it. And in the mandates, they say, I'm going to solve other people's problems. And I think that it's really important for us to rethink through how relational poverty actually is. And that one of the great dilemmas of poverty is that the poor think they have nothing to offer. Now, poverty is definitely economic, don't get me wrong. But poverty is so much more about social, physical, emotional, spiritual. Ultimately, poverty is about relationships. People saying, I have nothing to offer. I have no choices. Poverty is a form, an expression of fatalism. And in our Canadian cities, with the dispersion of poverty, we are facing relational poverty on monumental levels. So, when we look at the data, we're looking at these massive principal dimensions of change. We're looking at the polarized social landscape. And then we're looking at poverty, particularly its geographic dispersion in our census metropolitan areas. So then that leads me then to ask the question about, oops, I just got to find my piece of paper here, make sure I don't forget something. Well, so far so good. Let's talk then about 3 steps in the process. If we want to pursue this spiritual, social transformation of our city regions and do it in a contextual way. First of all, it means we've got to study our neighborhoods seriously. We've got to study place. Now, the great advantage we have as Canadians is that there's no other country in the world that studies itself like Canada. Statistics Canada is an industry in and of itself. It's kind of a nice way of saying Canadians are myopic. Okay? But we love to study ourselves. Now, so therefore, as a missiologist, I say, boy, if the Canadian government is going to study us, let's, as the church, use the data so that we understand our neighborhoods. Now, in one of the articles on the CD-ROM, which I can draw to your attention, I actually go through the lines in the census data that are very important for every church to master so that you understand place. Now, obviously, I'm giving a priority here to geographic mission, so that we're taking our neighborhoods, our communities, our boroughs, our city regions seriously. We want to study place. Which means that when we study our communities, when we study our boroughs, we're not so much interested in comparing them to see how they're similar. Really what we want to do is we want to study them to see how they're different. And there's always 5 sets of data that you always want to pay attention to when you study your neighborhood, when you study your city region. You obviously want to study what's going on with families. You want to study what's going on economically. You want to study issues of ethnicity and culture, language. You're going to want to study religion, religious affiliation. You're going to want to study family cycles, what's going on within the family itself. And therefore, you're going to want to be doing some contrasting from one neighborhood, from one borough to another. You want to master your community. As someone who studies and loves cities, I'm always a little bit surprised at how much churches don't know about their communities. We think we know our communities. But what I'm saying is that if we're going to have this authentic missional encounter with our cities, we've got to make sure we know our communities. The best place to start, but not the only place, the best place to start is with the census data. Get your heads around it. Now that would lead then to studying our cities in terms of space. The way people think. Now here we've got a lot more in harmony with other cities across Canada. One could even make the case right across the Western world. Now we're looking at worldviews, what I prefer to call as social imaginaries. That way that we think about life. Those presuppositions that we hold in common about life itself. But it's in this space where some of the greatest challenges to a missional encounter take place. Let me just highlight 5 things that I think are going on in the social imaginary, the mindset of people in our Canadian cities today. These will come as no surprise to you, but let me get them out there so we can talk about them. Certainly, the hyper-individuality of our culture is absolutely stunning. Here's how this drives itself in the data. In my city, which tends to be a little bit higher than everyone else on this one, believe it or not, on the island of Montreal, 1.8 million people, 40% of Montrealers live alone. 40% of Montrealers live alone. That's only a slightly bit higher than Toronto and Vancouver, primarily because it's cheaper to live in Montreal than it is to live in Toronto and certainly Vancouver. If you live alone in Vancouver, you're making big bucks. But people do it. But it's an expression of the autonomy that people feel in our culture today. Now, in case you think I'm being hard on Canadians when I talk about our individuality, I also want to contend that, churches can practice hyper-individuality. Denominations can practice hyper-individuality. A church that finds itself in its neighborhood and it says, we are going to reach this neighborhood all by ourselves by the year 2015, are nothing other than practicing a corporate hyper-individuality. And denominations do the same thing all the time. It's a way of perceiving reality. And it's part of the social imaginary. A second thing going on in space today, this won't come as any surprise to you, is the hyper-consumerism of our culture. And couple that with the third thing, the hypersexualization of our culture. And then when you think about it, think about the pursuit of prestige that goes in our culture, or finally, the quest for power. Now, I will contend that if we're going to do contextual theology, contextual mission, we're going to want to make sure that in our churches, we're addressing those, what we call in social terms, those heavy tendencies, that social reality that people find themselves in. So in the hyper-individuality of our culture, we need to make sure that in our churches we're practicing community. I like to teach my students when I do my lectures on the Trinity. I always like to teach my students, God, the triune God, is a small group. And the church, as the reflection, the copycat of the triune God, needs to be practicing authentic community. To deal with the hyper-consumerism of our culture, we need to be people who practice simplicity. In the hypersexualization of our culture, we need to be promoting faithfulness. Faithfulness for those of us that are married, faithfulness for our sisters and brothers that choose celibacy. How are we practicing faithfulness? In the face of the pursuit of prestige, we need to be communities of humility. And finally, when we think about the quest for power that goes on in our culture, what are we doing to promote service? So as you put this together, as you study your community place, and you put this together with space and those 5 heavy tendencies, then you begin to think, okay, what does the gospel look like in our community? How do we contextualize God's revelation in the Scriptures and most ultimately in Jesus Christ? How do we contextualize that in our neighborhoods? Now, if you're looking for a synonym here, contextualization is really about weaving together. So we're going to weave together God's revelation in the Scriptures and the Bible, the Scriptures and Jesus Christ in the Bible. Weaving together what we learn about place, weaving together what we hear about how people think and live, and then we begin to say, okay, what does this look like? What's the goal? Now, take a copy of that brochure, and let's go to the goal for a minute before I get into some practical things that I think are important in these networks that are pursuing social and spiritual transformation. This is a descriptive brochure of the organization that I'm the director of in Montreal, called Christian Direction. Turn to the back of it. Turn to the back side of it. Does everybody have a copy of the brochure? I think so. People at the door were most gracious. If you look on the back side of this, we call this the 12 indicators of a transformed city. Now, let me just tell you a little history here for 2 seconds. Back several years ago, I was sitting with my colleagues at Christian Direction, and you'll see on the other side that our vision is to see God transform urban communities by the concerted actions of committed Christians. And I innocently said to my colleagues, if God was to do that, if God was to transform urban communities by the concerted actions of committed Christians, what would it look like? How would we know that God did that? And there was dead silence in the room for about 45 seconds. And that was a miracle in and of itself, because I can never shut my team up. And then somebody said, "That's a great question." And that set us on a journey. We did stakeholder interviews, we interviewed kids, we interviewed mothers, we interviewed church leaders, we got our board involved, and we came up with these 12 indicators whereby we said that if God, through the concerted efforts of committed Christians, was to transform the cities of Quebec, here, humbly, by God's grace, is what we think God might do. Now, again, this is the goal that we're looking to as we take the data seriously, as we pursue contextualization. Here's the outcomes that we're looking at. Now, if you look at the bottom of this presentation, you'll have what I refer to as the subway lines. Okay? This is what goes on underneath the surface, but you never see. So you've got the blue line, the yellow line, the brown line, and the green line. Okay? The church becomes the incarnation of reconciliation. Reconciliation is about making the peace. The people of God are invited to be instruments of reconciliation, of peace. They move out into their urban community in evangelization and service. They do both. Not one or the other, not one at the expense of the other. They do both. They're in society, pursuing justice and forgiveness, and they take creation seriously. We understand the mandates of creation were to take care of what God has created. Now, based on that, what are we anticipating God to do? Well, number one, we say we need an increasing number of churches that are actively involved in the spiritual transformation of their city regions. We just know in Quebec that if God is going to use the church to transform culture, we just need more churches. We need more Bible studies. We need more home groups. We need more Christians in the marketplace meeting together. We just don't have enough. We need more. So when we see those growing, we can say, God, you're at work. But number two, we need to make sure that the people of God are animated by a passionate spirituality and are involved in concrete acts of reconciliation and justice for the welfare of their city regions. So we just want to see more Christians. Remember what we said. It's the concerted actions of committed Christians. So we just need to see more people mobilized and trained. Now, you can go down through the list. Some of these are really quite obvious. For example, number 6, we want to see healthy adults, great marriages, vibrant families. We want to see AIDS and drug addiction prevention increasing. We want to see a decrease in the suicide rate. Those are all issues that are big in Quebec cities. We've just said, we got to see that change. And when it's changing, we'll know that the concerted actions of committed Christians is obvious. Now, number 7, this is classic Quebec. We want to see a promotion of integrity in the public sphere in Quebec society. If transformation is taking place, people are just going to be more honest. When that happens, that will be the true miracle. You can go through the list. All we're saying in these indicators is that here are things that we are trusting God to do. This is the objective that we have in mind. Now, what's been so beautiful is that there are, in our communities, 4 networks in 4 different parts of the cities that have adapted all of this, and together in their networks are pursuing the social and spiritual transformation, and this is the goal in mind. So transformation is not just a catchword, but it actually becomes something very concrete that people are looking to do. Let me give you one little illustration, and then let me talk about these collaborative efforts. In my city and in my culture, we have an epidemic. It's called high school dropout. In the neighborhood where my wife works as a community development organizer, the church that we go to, 5 years ago, we knew that 53% of all of the boys who started high school that year, 53% of them would not finish high school. It's a little lower for girls. We knew that because we studied the data. In a globalizing world, if you don't finish high school, you don't have much of a future. Here's how it works out. Very down to earth. A high school dropout maximizes his revenue, his income, gets to the top in Quebec at $27,000. A university graduate last year in my province started at $43,000 a year and goes up from there. Any politician or bureaucrat ought to figure out really quick, if you've got 53% of your boys that are going to max out at $27,000 a year, you're missing, pardon?
Less tax base.
Less tax base, exactly. So anybody would think, we got to help boys finish school, it's just going to be good for the revenue of the province. Quite apart from the fact that that's a rather utilitarian way to look at it. But, so we know this stuff about our neighborhood. About 6 weeks ago, my colleague who runs a center in that community, it's a center that's been started by Christian Direction, he came dancing into a staff meeting. He said, we've just finished our most recent site visits. And he was bringing our data up to date, and he said, we've got the dropout rate down to 48%. You would have thought that Jesus had come back. Now, were we happy? Of course we were delighted. But still, half of the boys aren't going to finish high school. But at least we're moving in the right direction. And so that affects outcome number 4 of the 12. Just an example, when you know your neighborhood, you know the strategies you want to put in place, and so that's why we have a bias for kids, and why we always start off with making sure that there's good after-school mentoring programs, good after-school tutoring programs. We've started in our neighborhood 3 micro-enterprise projects for kids and their mothers for wealth generation, teaching them financial capability. All of these things are just practical ways that you begin to think about bringing space and place and scriptures together and then creative strategies to pull it off. Now, one last thought, and then we'll get into some dialogue here. What do these networks look like? How do you do this in a collaborative way? I want to contend that these networks are intentionally ecumenical. These networks are intentionally collaborative. And these networks are intentionally helping people to volunteer in the social sector. When I say intentionally ecumenical, what I'm saying is churches working together, and I'm using ecumenical in the best and in the historic sense of the word, that we're very seriously about working interdenominationally, that we're taking the contributions of everybody seriously. They're intentionally cooperative in that we're partnering with social service agencies as well. In the age of declining tax revenues, we've learned really quick, our Canadian governments, whether at the national, the provincial, or the municipal level, are not meeting all the needs. They can't afford it. This is an opportunity now to promote voluntarism. But before we get to the third part, intentionally volunteering, let me just talk about these collaborative efforts for a minute. These collaborative efforts means that we as Christians will open up dialogue and find ways to serve the local library, the local clinic, certainly the local primary and secondary schools. We'll get serious about participating with other social service agencies in the neighborhood because what are we looking at? We're looking to pursue the social and spiritual transformation of the neighborhood, of the community, of the borough. And so we're taking the whole community seriously. And we're looking at ways to do that partnership in a very concrete manner. Now, we can look at some of those collaborative efforts and how to do them in just a minute. So, we're intentionally ecumenical, we're intentionally collaborative, with everybody who's working in the community. And then we're intentionally equipping and deploying people to be volunteers. Which means that we're, rather than starting our own things, we're joining what's already there. Now, I would contend that I think this just makes good biblical sense. Because when we think about this through the lens of the Bible, we realize that God, by His Spirit, is at work in the neighborhood even before the church shows up. Let me repeat that. We take seriously the fact that God, by His Spirit, is at work in the neighborhood even before the local church shows up. And so therefore we're going to say, okay, how is the hospital an expression of God at work in the neighborhood? How's the local medical clinic a manifestation of that? The library, the school. It's what we call in biblical terms common grace. You know, the local school doesn't save somebody spiritually. Neither does the sewer system, neither does the prison, neither does City Hall. But they are expressions that God cares for the neighborhood, that God cares for the city. So therefore, we want to join where God is at work. And then we bring the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ through our volunteering. Now, volunteering is in a crisis situation in Canada. Why? Hyper-individuality, hyper-consumerism. People care about me, myself, and I. When you study volunteering across Canada, there's only one thing that people who volunteer on a weekly or monthly basis share in common. They don't share a common economic status. They're not all men or all women. They don't even share a common academic background, i.e., the more people are educated, the more they volunteer. No, they don't even share that in common. You know what volunteers across Canada, the only thing they share in common? They go to their local church, their local synagogue, or their local mosque on a weekly basis. In other words, they're people of religious practice. Now, we all know what's happening to weekly church attendance in Canada. It's going south. So what's going to happen to volunteerism? It's going to go south. So therefore, there's where we as followers of Jesus in our communities get really serious. And we say, we're going to train and deploy our members, our parishioners, so that they serve in the structures of the culture. And that's where mission begins. And I'd like to suggest to you that when we get serious in these networks about being intentionally interdenominational ecumenical, when we become intentionally pursuing collaboration, and when we're intentional about mobilizing our churches to volunteer in the structures of our culture, we are on the cutting edge of a new missional engagement with our city regions. So, started off with 3 preliminary reflections. Followed it up by defining what's going on in our cities. And then I said, there's 3 things we got to do. We got to study our neighborhoods. We got to study space. And then finally, we need to pursue these networks in an intentional manner. Let's, why don't we take a few minutes for questions. Like I said, this is a 2-part series, so we've got lots of time in the second part to get into the mechanics of this. But maybe there's some things that I've said too quickly and you need some clarification, and then we'll go from there. Yeah, go ahead.
The last statement there, where you said that the mission begins with serving the social structure in our culture. Some prototypes. I can think of Daniel and people like that were involved in the government and so on and so forth. Any more thoughts there?
I think one of the...
Commands from Christ or Paul.
with my students, I like to do Bible studies with them. I know it really says you're a professor of missiology doing Bible studies. I realize that sounds like an oxymoron. But anyway, I get my students to study characters, study people in Scripture. What bounces out at them is how many of the illustrative material of people in the Bible is people who didn't go into what you and I would call vocational Christian service. They were involved in let's call it tent making. They were involved in ministry in their community. The list goes on and on and on. None less than the Apostle Paul, Acts chapter 18, when he gets to Corinth, the great economic center of the Roman Empire, what did he do? He pulled out his ability as a leather maker and worked as a leather maker in his community. So your point is incredibly well made. Yeah, go ahead.
My ministry has been working on socioeconomic research and development in Victoria. The era of the single parent or of the single income family has all but evaporated. You've got one or both parents doing full-time or part-time work. You've got the children in eons and eons of activities after school. Then you've got the parents trying to do all the grocery shopping as well. What we've come up with is like community cooperative, community employment, community volunteerism, infrastructure. Do you have any really quick advice on how to approach the administration of that? Or should I connect with you later?
No, let's jump into that in the second half. Okay? Because that's a really good question. Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot of good illustrations out there. Let's get into that. We'll follow up on that in the second half. Great. Yes?
And when people ask questions, can they stand up and turn around?
And turn around and speak into the mic. Great idea. Okay, we'll do that for sure. Yeah. Blair, how much time do we have?
You've got about 1 minute.
About 1 minute. Okay. Okay. Well, listen. So what we'll do... Well, Flynn, you want to ask a question first?
I want to know where the poor area of West Vancouver is.
Okay. I'll refer you to Hillside Baptist Church. They showed it to me. Okay, well, let's pause there. We're going to take a break. We start back up again at
4:30.
At 4:30. Okay. Now, again, if any of you are interested in getting a copy of the CD-ROOM that has a lot of articles, practical ideas, a lot of the stuff I've talked about, feel free to come up and get it. It's $15. And we'll take a break. And when we come back, I'll just do a quick summary for those that weren't in on the first one, and then we'll just jump in on your questions, and we'll put together some strategies related to this. Okay? Thanks so much for coming.